Welcome back to Yuri's Box. In this video, I'm going to talk about the Federal Reserve policy mistake. If you enjoy this kind of content, consider leaving a like and perhaps subscribing to the channel. And as usual, nothing in this video is financial advice. So, what I really wanted to talk about is try to hone in to really the fundamentals of the economy, potentially. And it is something that I've been talking about, as we've drifted away from the tariff drama, because it is my kind of expectation, really, that as we move away from tariff drama and potentially, more towards more constructive talk around trade deals, that we slowly will eventually have to deal with the fundamentals of the economy, and whether they are more akin to something that we saw during the summer, or if everything is holding up just fine as the period that goes from September till January possibly led us to believe. And one of the ideas that I get, that again is I tried to challenge to the best of my abilities, that is the idea that again, the economy is just fine the way it is, and that we really don't need any stimulus in the economy, because that would just exacerbate inflation. And in fact, we still have to keep the fight against inflation going. And so this is something that I hear a lot being talked about in relation to the Fed, for example. Meaning, what you have in front of you is something like initial jobless claims. This is the 2006-2008 cycle. Just leaving that aside for a minute, fast forwarding till today, the idea is, why should the Fed be cutting if initial jobless claims are, as of last week, at 215,000, which, and at historically, 215 is really, really low. All right, we weren't even at 215,000 during the 06-08 cycle. We were well above that. The lows were actually at 280. Right, if we saw 280 now, I mean that would that would be an entirely different ball game. So I think this is a great place to start. Why should the Fed be cutting at a time where, for example, initial jobless claims are at cycle lows? Well, I've spoken about this in previous videos as well, and I'll give you the same analogy as I did before. Saying that you don't have to cut and you don't have to stimulate the economy or rather, I'm not going to stimulate the economy and I'm not going to lower rates because until initial jobless claims break out, is like saying I'm not going to shower until I smell like rotten eggs. If you're waiting that long, that means you're late. All right, you should have showered long and gone, man. All right. So what do I mean by that? If we go and look at the 2006-2008 cycle, we had a huge spike here in 2005, but leaving that aside, we didn't really break out of, this bottoming pattern, at the very least until April, at worst until July of 2008, which was well after the beginning of the financial crisis. For reference, Bear Stearns was right here. All right. We were at 368,000 for the week of the collapse of Bear Stearns, but arguably things had already started to kind of go downhill before that. Bear Stearns doesn't just fall out of the sky. And this leads me to really another point I want to drive home, and that is that the idea that recessions don't really, again, fall out of the sky. I am a believer of the idea that recessions are kind of a murder case, meaning that the economy on its own tends to do fine. The problem is that usually a recession occurs because of some kind of a shock. Something that is external, exogenous, comes around and just slaps you in the face, and it takes you by surprise. What I would add to that is that it is a murder case, but there is usually an accomplice. And the accomplice is an environment where you have stagnant hiring rates, and for the time being, stagnant firing rate. All right. So you have an environment where, yes, the layoffs are low, as you can see from here, the layoffs and discharges. As of today, layoffs are still, pretty benign. As of really the last report we got, layoffs are still at benign levels. But fast forward till today, the hiring rate is definitely off the highs, and we are back at levels seen in December of 2025, which, by the way, is exactly where we were in the 06-08 cycle, when the hirings in the economy actually topped out. All right. And this is key in my opinion, because again, you have shocks hit the economy, but in my opinion, a shock isn't enough. You have to have an environment where the economy is, yes, it's just chugging along, but the problem is that it's not booming. All right. It's not on the way up, like from 2003 up till, let's say, the peak of 06, right here. We are no longer on the uptrend. We're just bobbing around. And that leaves the door open for the shock to take place and really have a bad effect on the economy. Now, I want to give you an example of why the stagnant hiring rate is important, in my opinion. And that leads me to 2022. Because if you think back to 2022, we really didn't have a recession, right? This kind of the bear market of 2022 was mostly due to the fact that we had to play catch up with inflation, all right? We had kind of shrugged inflation aside. We had believed that inflation was transitory until kind of March of 2022, when we really just woke up to the fact that rates would have to go much, 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 much higher. I mean, I remember watching this play out, and I remember seeing people with great experience say that the terminal rate would probably be around 2%, maybe 3%, but they can't go any higher than that because they'll break something. All right. Eventually, they went up till 5.5%. But regardless of that, during this time, if you're going to look at the hiring rate was still at cycle highs, and it stayed at cycle highs until really 2023, and arguably the second half, the first half of 2023. Regardless, hirings were on the uptrend, meaning that whatever kind of shock came was probably going to be absorbed. And you might say, well, yeah, we didn't really have much of a shock in 2022 apart from inflation. But I would argue against that, because in February of 2022, we had the Ukraine war. And the Ukraine war brought a lot of goodies with it. All right, and I'm being sarcastic, in case you haven't, just to specify. And what do I mean by that? Well, oil. If you look at oil, excuse me, from the bottom in 2021, which is kind of when you started getting the talk about the potential of a war in Ukraine, oil spiked from 63 when its bottom of $63 up to $126 in March of 2022. Now, oil going up to $126, yes, correct, is definitely a huge shock to the economy, because oil is in everything. It's in even, I mean, it's not literally in the water we drink, but I mean, in the food we eat. But I mean, just think transportation, just think production, right? So if oil doubles in price effectively, that is a huge drag on the economy. But potentially, because we had such big stimulus, we were on the uptrend, that alone was not enough to derail the economy. And sure enough, the economy just, did fine. I mean, again, as I point out in many of my previous videos, right here is when we had the recession fears, and they stayed well into 2023 until, I would argue, July, right? And really October, which is when everybody then had to play catch up, and that's what really just fueled the big part of, the big gains in the economy. So again, why didn't we see a recession when we had oil at $126? Because the economy was still in good shape. We didn't have the accomplice, meaning an environment where you have hiring, the hiring rate kind of flatten out and just bob around. So again, where we are today is definitely as well off the lows, really well off the highs right here. And in my opinion, it is leaving the door open for a potential shock. Meaning that whatever happens next, and I mean, it doesn't have to necessarily happen. I would rephrase that too. If something were to happen in the next weeks, months, it would come at a great cost, because we don't have an economy that is booming. It is just chugging along. It is, yes, we still haven't seen, again, the famous hard data roll over yet. But I would argue that if you're waiting for the hard data to roll over, meaning that if you're waiting for initial jobless claims to, say, spike up to 300K before you lower rates, that's, again, like saying you're not going to shower until you smell bad. I mean, usually initial jobless claims are the last to move, really. And in fact, if you look at the layoffs in the non-farm payroll, non-farm, layoffs really didn't spike up and have their significant spike until really 2009. And by the time layoffs spiked, that was the end of the recession. So initial jobless claims, layoffs come at the very end of the cycle. And if you're waiting for layoffs, and if you're waiting for initial jobless claims to go up, what you're doing is you're setting yourself up for failure, in my opinion, and you're setting yourself up to be late. And I'll also add, before I end the video, that I see a lot of, very, very short-term takes in regards to rate cuts or rate hikes. And I think that this is born from, well, for lack of a better definition, COVID PTSD. Because we have this, I think COVID is kind of upset expectations, meaning that we expect everything to move very, very fast. But as far as history is concerned, things move very, very slowly. Things take a long time to play out. And whenever you're placing, for example, monetary policy, now again, I'm just a schmuck with a YouTube channel. I mean, again, I could easily be wrong. But the way I view things is that when you're setting things like economic, monetary policy and interest rates, you really have to think in the future. You have to think, I'm setting policy for where I want it to be in, 12 months out. Okay. 25 basis point rate cut does not have a material effect in, the following month. It has a material effect down the line. Now, that is not to say that if the Fed dropped rates to 0% and started QE, that would not have an immediate effect. That would definitely have immediate effect, but we're talking about dramatic moves at that point. If we're talking about slowly shifting your priorities from inflation to really the labor market, slowly, right? Say you have a consistent 25 basis point rate cut. I don't see anything wrong with that. And I don't buy into the inflation PTSD, which is something that I talk about a lot in my videos. And I do believe that as really the Fed stays complacent with the way things currently are, it is just leaving the door open for really bigger rate cuts down the line. So again, as far as I'm concerned, the longer the Fed stays complacent, the more they'll have to do down the line, in my opinion. And I think that the next 2 weeks are important, because next week we have the S&P PMI reports, and then in 2 weeks' time we have the non-farm payroll report, which again could continue to say, that everything is fine. We'll see what comes out of them. However, I do believe that the Federal Reserve should be cutting rates, slowly adjusting interest rate policy to reflect low hiring, a low quits rate, and let's not forget inflation, which while it may still be above 2%, it is currently sitting at 2.4%. I think when it comes down to the balance of risks, the Fed is potentially still on the tight side. And, if they come out and cut, let's say, 25 basis points in May, that won't be enough, in my opinion. And again, just to drive the point home, if you look at what happened in 2008, the the Federal Reserve cut rates in January by about, I think, 100 basis points, if I'm not mistaken. And after that, arguably you might say, oh, inflation went up to 5.6%, so the Fed made a mistake. And that is actually something that, if I'm not mistaken, Kevin Walsh, which is one of the one of the options that Trump is potentially considering as a substitute for Powell, he was on the record, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, you can fact check me in the comments, for being hawkish in 2008, and where, the Fed should have actually hiked rates in 2008. Again, inflation was at 5.6%, but, we just had Lehman Brothers a few months later, and we were in deflation town at that point. So if you let inflation be your only metric, in my opinion, you'll be blindsided by everything else. If you just look at inflation and you ignore the hiring rate being well off the highs and really stagnate, and let yourself be complacent because layoffs are low, I just think you'll have to acknowledge them later on, and that will come at a great cost, because by the time you have to acknowledge them, something happened potentially, and you'll have to do more than you would have otherwise. So I'll leave it at that. Just to summarize, one of the reasons why I think that, recessions are usually a murder case, as I said before, but I don't think that is enough. You really have to, it is a murder case, but they require an accomplice. And say, I look at the S&P 500 and the bear market of 2022, and while we did have a bear market, we didn't have a recession. And not because of a lack of shocks. Just look at oil and what oil did from 2021 till March of 2021, and it stayed at the highs until June of 2022. Again, it wasn't because of a lack of a shock. It was because the economy was still booming. It was still on the uptrend. Hires were still at the cycle highs. No problem. If you look at the quits rate and what that was telling you, the quits rate stayed at cycle highs until really May of 2023. So you were lacking the so-called accomplice. You did have shocks, but you didn't have an economy that was primed for, really fragile and again, primed for negative surprises. Okay. So where does that leave us today? Well, hiring rate is low, layoffs are low, but that shouldn't allow us to be complacent about where the economy is, and we'll see how economic data continues to evolve. If you like this kind of content, consider leaving a like, and I'll see you next time. Bye.